At Harvard, who were some of the people that both helped to shape your intellectual formation and also left a trace in terms of the kind of scholarship that you found yourself drawn to?
Well, there were quite a few. I was fortunate to be able to work with Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who, speaking of people who are meticulous, he is quite astonishing. He had the habit with his graduate seminars of getting from the library all of the major works that you cited in your paper, and then he would check your quotations of those against the original text in quite a few languages. And then he would write out comments, or actually he dictated them in the year I took a seminar from him. And he would start with the alphabetical order of the bibliography. And it was a very impressive experience to have, to see how much care he took with every little thing. And I learned some really important things from him that I'll never forget. And it reminds me also of one figure that I had an opportunity to work with at Stanford University, who was not on the regular faculty, but was a scholar resident in the Hoover Institution, and that was Erich Vogelin, the German philosopher of history. His wide-ranging historical analysis of civilization and culture was very inspiring and helped me to think about what possibilities there were for lending some new visions to the study of Islamic cultures.
And Schimmel Khanum.
Anna Marie Schimmel was a remarkable figure, and I really had a tremendous experience with her. She worked with all of her students. She cared a great deal about them and their work and their future, and they were her children. We were her children, in fact. She had worked out a situation at Harvard where she had a chair that had been established by these two Afghani brothers. It was called the Ozai Durrani chair, but more informally it was known as the Minute Rice chair, because they had invented the process for the food product called Minute Rice. And the chair was established for to have, you see, they had studied in India, and they loved, as many Afghans do, the poetry of Bidal. But they also loved the poetry of the Urdu poet, Ghalib, who was much in the same tradition. And so it was designed to include the study of Ghalib as one of the major requirements. And I believe she cataloged a lot of the Urdu books in the library initially. But she had eventually made a deal with the dean where she would only teach one semester every year, but she might teach as many as 7 classes. Now, some of these classes included third-year Sindhi, and how many students would sign up for that? But I remember very well when I first arrived there, and in the spring term when she showed up, and she offered a class on Indo-Persian mystical texts, and we began by reading the Khairul Majalis of the Malfuzat conversations of Sheikh Nasiruddin Chiraghi Dehli, one of the great Chishti masters. And it was such a really interesting experience because the Persian is conversational, and people wander into the Sheikh's circle and complain about taxes or ask for some money, and people cry, and all these kinds of stories went on. And so that was really a great experience. And so we looked at some letters and some poetry and things like this. And Schimmel is kind of legendary because people were fascinated with the way that she would close her eyes when she lectured. And it was almost as if she had the contents of a lecture written on the inside of her eyelids. And she would play with her bangles and go on with the most astonishing details. And of course, her facility for quotation of these classical texts was astonishing. And that is something which I adopted as well. Because to have a poem at your hand when a question comes up, when I have my reading courses, which I'm still doing, and an important word comes up that Hafiz used, then it's time to bring up that poem. You know, I try to get my students to do this, but they're not as somehow as eager to do that as I think they should be.
Literacy has changed in some ways, and there's something about all the facility of being able to Google almost everything, which I think has really had a detrimental effect on that capacity to commit poetry and sayings to heart. And when I think about the way you were describing Wilfred Cantwell Smith, checking each citation, this is all, of course, being done in an age prior to computers,
exactly.
Right? And these kind of skills do leave. I think they leave a trace. They reprogram our memory and our ability to recollect things and to have them become a part of our beings. And we've gained so much, but we've also lost quite a lot.
Well, that's true. In the future of edited text is going to be in digital publication. And that's something that I want to continue to work on. But the memorization is so important. And so to be able to summon a verse by Hafiz and say, for instance, شگویم که در میخانه دوش مست و خراب سروش عالم غیب چی مجدی ها داده است. He said it very well. So it deserves to be remembered.
So we were speaking about your connection with Anne-Marie Schimmel.
Yes.
And, she, of course, famously wrote multiple books on Maulana.
Yes.
On the Prophet, on Islam, on Indo-Persian texts, on Mughal figures.
Yes.
And when I think about your scholarship, writing on the Quran, on Hallaj, on Ruzbahan, on Ain al-Ghazat, coming back to contemporary period and writing on following Muhammad, on the academic study of Islam, Eternal Garden. Did you find that you consciously thought about the example of people like Schimmel in terms of the historical and geographical breadth that they allowed themselves to explore? Because this doesn't happen in many other fields. You wouldn't see...
That's true.
Yeah, you wouldn't see someone who's a scholar of the New Testament also publishing on the Renaissance and on Black theology and...
No, you're quite right. This is partly a function of the status of Islamic studies as a field, in which, even now it's undersupplied. We have a smaller number of people than we need in the academy for a proper treatment of the wide range of materials and questions. And when I started, it was even much more pathetic. There was, the year I finished graduate school in 1981, there was one job in Islamic studies, which was a one-year replacement. And so people couldn't imagine why I had entered into this field. But what I noticed with Schimmel, and as you pointed out, the rigorous approach to language was a big part of that. But I saw that she would take an author or a text and have a systematic approach to grasping it in its totality. And she did this in terms of philology by note cards, where she would assemble references to the same symbols, and she had a vast file of material like this. And I also noticed that when I paid attention to, for instance, the École des Hautes, the École Pratique in the Sorbonne in Paris, was where Henri Corbin taught. And the catalog of the courses from there, somehow I had access to a copy of that. And it was clear that he would give a course on a particular theme or individual or a text, and then he would write
A book on.
a booklet.
Yeah.
And so I thought, that's a way you can do something very solid. Pick a project that is necessary for some reason, and then do it very thoroughly, and then make connections and explain why it's significant. And then I also developed a method where of trying to ground my work empirically, as well as connecting to theoretical concepts. And by empirically, what I mean is, when you go through a text, I would organize the material according to the most natural divisions. If there were certain themes that came up, I would start to put the quotations or the references to that theme all in one place. And then I would survey the whole material, and I would see that there were three major themes or problems. And then I would figure out a way to connect them, and then with liberal use of quotation as evidence, make an argument. So my conference papers are often based on that kind of approach. And a few more words about Schimmel. She was very supportive and incredibly responsive. She provided the model of the teacher. Even when she was away, I would send her a chapter when she was in Germany, and in 2 weeks I would get a response. And so that was really a great model. And I remember coming back from India when my wife and I spent a year there when I was doing research. And that's where I was exposed to another whole level of text, because I went to Aligarh, and K.A. Nizami introduced me to the world of Persian manuscripts. And I would just go to the library there and pull out manuscripts and start working on them. And I didn't know they were supposed to be that hard, but I evolved my own methods of dealing with them. And I made my own microfilms with a tripod and a single lens reflex camera that I had simple black and white photographs for. And I went around and photographed material that I used for years and years, and I still have printouts of this material. But on the way back, we stopped and visited Schimmel in Bonn, in Germany, and she was the soul of hospitality. It was really great. And I remember she cooked us a delightful dinner of beef bourguignon one night, and that was really great. I would also mention other names. Wheeler Saxton, I learned a tremendous amount from him about how to read text. Bill Graham in Islamic Studies, he was on my committee, a great scholar. And I also had the chance to be a teaching assistant for Albert Lord, who was one of the great figures in the study of oral composition. He was the assistant to William Perry when they went in the 30s to Yugoslavia to record the bardic compositions of the Yugoslavian tradition. And Lord taught a course with over 800 students on oral and epic literature, and I was able to gain my position as a teaching assistant with him because I said I could read Homer and Ferdowsi. So that was 2 epics. He said, "That's great. You can work for me."
Wow. You mentioned having gone to India.
Yes,
and having studied with Kane Nizami,
right.
um, I think over the years this has been another hallmark of your career, is not only intellectual exchanges with Schimmel is German,
Right.
many of the scholars you mentioned are American, but also long-standing friendship and relationship with Indian, Pakistani, Iranian, Arab, Turkish scholars.
Yes, that was the beginning of my international experiences in Islamic studies. And I should add that the original plan that year, 1978, was to go to Iran to study in Mashhad, and I had plans to work on manuscripts in Astan Rezavi. And this revolution happened.
Got in the way of a Fulbright.
And I kept saying that this was nothing to worry about. And I, as usual, I'm not a very good political prophet. So we ended up going to India instead. And then that turned out to be a very rich experience. But it did open up these relationships with scholars. And this also included a year in Pakistan in 1986. And beginning about 1990, I started going to Turkey. And then in the late 90s, a couple of trips to Iran where you and I were together
On the Sadr Conference.
And then that started to continue into a number of other places. And so I went to the Gulf quite a bit, and other trips to Iran, Turkey frequently, India and Pakistan repeatedly. And then I started to go to Malaysia, and in the most recent years I was not planning on this, but West Africa. And so I've had the opportunity to look at Islamic studies in so many different environments. And it's been extraordinarily important. And I've learned many things, not only from the scholars themselves, but from people who I got to know. I mean, it's been so important. And I would say that, you know, in a way, the fact that I did a book about Islamophobia and anti-Islamic prejudice was very important for me to do because of the debt of hospitality and gratitude that I owe to so many people who had treated me with graciousness and generosity. But so that was a bitter subject to investigate. And I was collecting files for years, particularly after September 11th, 2001. And so I felt it was really important to articulate what was going on in that situation. And here is a case where, as educators, we have a big responsibility. It's a very difficult job because the people who are most intent upon expressing this kind of hatred won't listen. So who can you reach? And there I think there is a method of scholarly writing that needs to become more adapted to the audience and should avoid the arrogance of using inside technical language, but instead create narratives that are attractive and compelling, that draw people in, and you can actually see it work when it works, when people are constructing a new idea that allows them to understand a humanizing aspect. But that has been one of the big challenges of Islamic studies. And people would frequently, you know, in Malaysia, they would say, "So why haven't you done anything to solve Islamophobia?" And I'd say, "Well, you know, we're doing our best here." And to a certain extent, this might seem to be self-serving, but I think that we shouldn't be necessarily judged by the results. of our publications. In other words, we can't be responsible for the way that people read our work or don't read our work. We can't control that. But we can do the right thing.
Mhm.
We can do something that is ethically preferable. And we have to do that kind of thing, even if people won't listen to us. But this is also the story of prophecy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even some of the prophets have a mixed track record on how well people listened to what they had to say.
Well, I think one of the most ironic lines in the New Testament is when Jesus says that a prophet is only without honor in his own country.
That's right. We get great receptions as soon as we start traveling. You know?
Right.
When you were talking about the Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism projects, I got a sense of the impact that you at least hope to have through this kind of writing.
Mm-hmm.
The bulk of your scholarship has been on the Sufi tradition.
Yes.
Who's your audience?
That's a good question. I think in some respects I was trying to create a new audience because the people who are already familiar with these texts and authors are few and far between. And so when I translated Rusbahan in his autobiographical work, The Kashf al-Asrar, I decided to get a poet to be my editor. And we had a long talk about, she and I had a long talk about what it means to write mystical text. And she said, in English, there is an appropriate style for mystical writing, which goes back to Middle English and the Cloud of Unknowing, which is a version of the mystical theology of Dionysius, the mystical work. And she said, this does not include a lot of Latinate and Greek words. As George Orwell would put it, don't talk to me about fortitude, say guts. There is a powerful language that is at the core of English. So anyway, she edited my translation, and she used yellow slips for each correction. There were about an average of 12 per page. And this improved the style of this dramatically. And I had extraordinary reports on that from people who have been profoundly affected by it. So in taking a previously unknown writer and trying to introduce that person, that is, it's a wonderful project because it's undiscovered territory. And so to be a guide into that area is a privilege that is not as easily found in the more well-trodden fields of research. And in European history and culture, there are so many things that have been done by previous pioneers. But we are in a field where my best estimate is, I've talked to Mohsen Kadivar about this and others, and my question to him is, what do you think? What is the percentage of Arabic and Persian texts that have ever been published in any form? Is it 10% or 5%? And we say 5%. I mean, this is not a scientific number, but I think in terms of general proportion, it accurately reflects the proportion of authors who have been published. And we have students who have done dissertations on authors, which is all in manuscript. So that's been one of the great delights of my work as a scholar is working with manuscripts. And until fairly recently, it was the only way that texts were produced. So if you want to know something before the 20th century, it's time to figure out how to read those difficult things. I just got a hold of a wonderful copy of a Sufi text from India, the Awrad-e-Ghawsiyya of Muhammad Ghaus, which is of an absolutely crystalline clarity, and the style of the writing is rigorously beautiful. And it also has annotations at the beginning from the sheikhs who have used the text. This manuscript is super high quality. It just thrilled me to see this. So I'm going to work with some people. We can come back to this, but there are some interesting digital projects going on now for increasing our access to these manuscripts.
That's great. I look forward to come back to that. Let's go back a little bit to finishing up at Harvard.
Oh, yes.
And am I right in remembering that your dissertation became your first book,
yes.
right? And you were talking about Halaj and Emil Bazad.
Right, this was the Shatiyat.
That's it, yeah, Words of Ecstasy. And so from that time, which now it's almost 40 years ago,
Indeed.
you've been in that world of formative period of the Sufi tradition.
Right.
How did you pick those people?
Well, again, I'll go back to Wilfred Cantwell Smith. This was the circumstances were that he had given a seminar called Faith and Belief.
Okay. He wrote a few books on that topic.
And this resulted in at least one or two publications. And every graduate student in that seminar would do a project on something related to faith and belief in whatever tradition they were studying. And I was thinking, faith and belief, faith and belief. And I remember that there was some Sufis who used a really interesting expression. They would say, well, there's the line from the beginning of Sana'i, the Hadith al-Haqiqat. Kufru iman dar rahet puyan, wahdahu la sharik lah buyan. So kufru iman, how can they be together? How can unbelief and faith be the same? And so I decided, let me just see if I can find something about this, because it's paradoxical. And Ruz Bahan turns out to have a lot of material about this, because he's collected these outrageous sayings of the Sufis, almost 200 of them. And then it's specifically devoted to Halaj and Bayazid as major figures whom he discusses. And so this gave me a topic that I had toyed around with, something to do with Sadi and Sohrawardi or something like that, but nothing had really gelled. But Schimmel had written about Ruzbahan and about his style. And so I remember showing the text to Cantwell Smith, and it has a very thorough index, the critical edition of the Sharh Shatiyat. And he was so admiring of the index, because it would allow you to find all the places where these things are located. And so it was in effect a kind of a counter example to what his project was in the seminar. But I did this 40-page paper for him, and that became the jumping off point for the dissertation. So it allowed me to look at the Shatiyat as a genre, as a rhetoric of transcendence, and many other topics, including the trials that went on and all of that. So it was really a great topic, and I even had a professor of Buddhism on my committee, and he talked about the Zen koan. So that was how that came about. And right, and so the other thing to say about this was that I was one of the first adopters of computers to write a dissertation. And at that time, you could only do it on a mainframe computer with a very complicated form of software that you had to introduce into it. But you could save $500, because that's how much it cost to hire a typist. So I did that on the computer, and that encouraged me to think about using technology all the time, and devoting theoretically 5% of my time to technology, so that I would be the one to make the decisions about how to use it.
So would it be fair to say that it was Hafiz and Maulana that led you to want to take on the study of Persian.
Yeah.
But Ruzbahan, in some ways, was your deep dive into the study of the Sufi tradition.
It was my first solo exploration.
Yeah.
And it allowed me to make some original observations. I mean, there's a lot more going on. And I'd like to go back to that text. I feel like I'm still... I tried to do a research project once. I wrote up a grant proposal to get the Arabic original of the Mantab al-Asrar, which was the way that Ruzbahan wrote this text at first. And then he translated it into Persian, but it's not the same text.
Yeah.
And there has been a publication of a critical edition based on a couple of manuscripts in Mashhad, but they don't have either the Tashkent manuscript or the manuscript that Louis Massignon had, which was from the 7th century. And it is very beautifully written. Although the copyist occasionally shows his outrage and condemns the contents of it a little bit. But anyway, I think it would be nice to go back and to translate the text from both the Arabic and Persian and keep them separate. And then we can see how he evolved. The Arabic has a section on Halaj in the beginning that's just quite stunning. So I'm not done with that.
And I seem to remember hearing that that's one of the projects that you might be looking forward to.
I think I'm going to, yes, chart out a little time for that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's wonderful. And Halaj, of course,
Halaj, of course.
You got to befriend him through Ruzbahan's engagement with him, and then you came back to him 30 years or so later.
Right. Well, Bess had been on the curriculum with Schimmel, and she had copied out these poems in her own handwriting, what they call a European hand of Arabic, which was quite distinctive. And I still have the class notes from those days. And it just was quite gripping. And when we read "Uqtuluni ya takhati inna fi khatmi hayati," wow, who writes like that? So I always kept that in mind. And when I started to teach graduate students at UNC, I would often, occasionally, like with Rick Colby and others, we would read those. And so it had been in the back of my mind, and so finally I said, let me just do it, because we don't have a complete translation of his diwan, although the question of what is in it and what is not is somewhat disputed. But that was a great project, and it took me 4 or 5 years to complete. And it was about, I have discovered some basic rules that I always observe, and I now teach formally to my students. You have to become very adept at recognizing the parallel, the antithesis, and you have to understand the metaphor to translate a text. Those are the key characteristics.
The metaphor, the parallel,
and the antithesis.
and the antithesis.
Because they use these all the time. They're the most powerful tools which they have, and which it's very effective when deployed in English, I would add. But the metaphor is really important, because sometimes you have to really break it down and then reformulate it in order to explain it properly.